Yo, what is going on, guys? My name is Anson, and welcome back to a brand new video. So this is going to be a part 2 of my Discord OAuth2 implementation from scratch. I guess you can call this a series now because we are going to make a couple of additional videos. But in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how we can save the user to the database. Because my plan is to show you guys how to save the user to the database first. And once we do that, we're going to also set up sessions. So that way we can actually save the user's session to the database as well. So whenever they, quote unquote authorize, we can actually keep them logged in onto our application. So every single time they visit the application, they'll stay logged in. They'll also be authenticated already so they can make protected requests. So let's say if you want to have an API that only has endpoints, that's only allowed for authorized or authenticated users. You'd want to make sure that your users are authenticated. And in order for us to do that, they need to send some kind of cookie from the client to our server. And the way they're going to get that cookie is we're basically going to create a session on the server. And that session, it's going to be sent back. The session ID is going to be sent back to the client. And the client is going to store it as a cookie. So upon every single request, it's going to send that cookie to the server. And that's how we're going to do our validation. We're going to do things such as checking to see if the cookie is expired. We're going to also learn how to serialize and deserialize the session. But that'll probably be for the third video. In this video, we want to focus primarily on saving the user to the database. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some refactoring to our code first, because right now we have everything in one file, and that's kind of a little bit ugly. And before we do that, I will mention that I do have all the code in a GitHub repository, and the link will be in the description. There's plenty of instructions on how to get started. And if you're confused on where to create the Discord Developer Portal application, or if you're confused on how to create a Discord application, definitely check out the first video. The first video shows you everything, and I'll leave a link in the description too. But there's tons of details on how to set up the code. Okay, but we're going to refactor a couple things. It's not going to take too long. Okay, but let's go ahead and get started. So we're using Express, and right now we have all of our routes inside one file, and it doesn't really look nice. And if we were to leave our application the way it is like this, it would actually make it hard to do things such as unit test, because right now we have a callback function, you can also call it an anonymous function as a callback function. There's no way that we would be able to mock out or unit test this function itself. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a simple structure. So I'm going to create a folder called routes, and inside this routes folder, I'm going to have each route inside over here. So right now, we only are going to have one main route, and that's going to be the auth route. And the auth route is basically going to be all the routes that are prefixed with auth or /API/auth. Okay, so for example, all the routes for example /discord/redirect, /auth/user, /auth/revoke, and etc. That will all belong in this auth route. Okay, and we're going to use an express router. So let me go ahead and create an index.ts file inside of the auth folder, not routes, but auth. So routes auth index.ts. So what we're going to do is we're going to import the router, and we're going to call this router function. It's going to give us the router, the express router instance. Okay, and you can use as many routers as you want. You can think of it like a mini express app. And the router itself has many functions that are similar to the app instance. So we can do something like router.get. Okay, and this is where we're going to register all of the auth routes. So for example, we're going to register the Discord /redirect route, and then we're going to have the callback function over here, except we're not going to just have an anonymous function that's just going to be passed as a callback here. We're actually going to create a function, and we're going to import that into this file, and then we're going to have all of the logic there. Okay, it's also going to be known as a controller. So let me go ahead and just define the route first, and we're going to define another route for the user. So there's going to be router.get/user. And you'll notice that I actually don't prefix these routes with /auth, because what we're going to do is we're actually going to export this router, and we're going to import it into an index.ts file that's going to live inside routes. So let me actually zoom in just a little bit more. So you can see I have an index.ts file over here, and this index.ts file lives inside the routes folder, but outside the auth folder. And it's also going to live outside all of the additional route folders that we might have. And what we're going to do is first let me just get the last route. So that's going to be /revoke. And then we're going to, let's see, export default router. Okay, so now what I can do is I can go inside the index.ts file, inside routes, and I'm going to import, and I'll call this auth routes from auth. So that'll import me the router. Okay, that's literally what we are exporting. And now we're also going to create another router, so we'll just simply import that. We'll create the router by calling the router function. And what we'll do is we'll call router.use. And this is where we're going to register all the prefixes for our routes. So think of it like this. Router.use/auth. And I'm going to pass in this router that is imported from auth/index.ts. So if I pass in here, what happens is we're basically registering every single route that's registered on this router. Okay, registered on the auth router. We're basically prefixing all of these routes with /auth. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is, let me go ahead and comment out all of this code over here. And let me actually move this up here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because if we need to use this code for future tutorials, it's a lot better that we have it refactored now instead of just having everything in one file and looking ugly. Okay. So right now, if we wanted to visit any of the routes for any of the auth routes, we'd actually visit /auth/discord/redirect, for example. But we want that /API prefix in front of all of the routes. Okay. So to do that, we're basically going to go ahead and call app.use and then prefix it, or for the first parameter, we'll do /API. And for the second parameter, we're going to need to actually pass in the router that comes from this index.ts file that's inside routes. Okay, you can also think of this as the file that registers every single route. Okay, so we already registered the auth route, and now we're going to export the router. And then in the index.ts file inside the source folder, in the main index.ts file, I know there's a lot of index.ts files, so it might be a little bit confusing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to import routes from /routes right over here. Okay, and this is a router as well. And when we pass that in as a second parameter, you can think of what's going on is we're taking every single route that's registered with this router. So now we have 3 routes. Okay, we have /auth/discord/redirect, /auth/user, /auth/revoke. We're taking all those routes that have been registered in the index.ts file in routes. We're exporting that router, or we're exporting that router. We're importing inside the main index.ts file, and we're prefixing it with /API. I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little bit confusing, but this is a common structure that we can follow. You don't have to do this, but I'd highly recommend it because it makes it a lot easier for you to manage your files later on. Okay, and that's the whole goal of this tutorial. So, like I said, right now, all we're really doing is we're creating a router that registers all the routes for the auth. We're taking the router inside routes/index.ts. We're prefixing all those routes with /auth. Okay, and then in the main index.ts file, we are prefixing everything with /API. Okay, so let me go ahead and also do one last thing. I'm going to go ahead and create a function, call it main, and we're going to basically call this main function. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to do all of the logic inside this main function. So for example, all of the creation of the Express app, registering all middlewares, etc., etc. That's all going to happen inside main. Okay, you can think of this like a bootstrap function that basically bootstraps the entire application for you. Okay, so after that, let's go ahead and actually run the code. So I should be able to just do yarn start dev. And the code should still run, but right now we don't have any endpoints to visit. Or we do, but we don't actually have any controllers, or we don't have any handlers for each of these routes, right? Because we only passed in the route name, but we don't have any of the actual handlers. So we actually have to create them. Okay, so what we're going to do is we have 3 routes that obviously have its own logic. Okay, and now when it comes to the handlers, you can also think of them like the controller of the route, and the controller is responsible for controlling the request that's coming in for that specific route. Okay, so we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call it controllers, and we're going to create a folder for the auth. We're going to create an auth folder inside controllers. Okay, now we're going to create an index.ts file. And what we're going to do here is we're basically going to create all of the necessary controller functions for each one of our routes. Okay, so for example, if we go back to the index.ts file, we can see that we have the /API/auth/discord/redirect route. And you can see that this async function, this anonymous callback function, that's also known as the handler of that route. Okay. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a function, and we'll call it a handle, or I'll call it a auth discord, or actually let's call it auth redirect controller, or I'll call it async function. There we go. And it's going to take in 2 parameters, so it's going to take in the same parameters as the handler. I mean, this is actually the handler function now. Okay, it's just that we're giving it a name for the function. Okay, so we're going to type annotate the request and response parameters. And what we could do is we could literally just take this whole code and we can just copy it and paste it inside this function. So I'm going to copy that, paste that in there. And we will need to do a couple things in order to get this to work. So first, we're going to need to import the URL. So I'm just going to copy and paste that from the main index.ts file. We're also going to need the environment variables. So I'll probably just copy this and move this here. And finally, we'll just need Axios. Okay, and okay, so we also have the access and the refresh token. So what I'll do is I'll simply just do this. We're going to not assign it to anything. We'll just log these 2 things for now. Okay, so let me go ahead and log that. Whoops. Okay, cool. And now I'm going to show you how this is going to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go into our, let's see, this auth route. We're going to paste that function in. We're going to import it. So now every single route or every single request made to this route is going to be handled with this function, this, quote unquote controller function. Okay. And the reason why I would recommend doing this is because, like I said, it's a lot easier for you to unit test because you have an anonymous function right over here, and you can't really import that function. You can't really mock it. You can't really do anything with this. So it makes it hard to test the logic. Okay. So right now we have a controller. We're going to worry about the service layer later. Okay. But right now we have the controller. So let's actually test everything out instead of making a bunch of changes all at once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just copy this URL, copy that, and I think I should have it somewhere. Let me paste this here for future reference. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to visit this URL, and we're going to go ahead and authorize, and you're going to see that it should visit this URL perfectly. And notice how nothing happened, right? I don't have any of these old URLs anymore. That was accessed through here. Okay, this /API/auth/discord redirect. Okay, and it's being handled by this function over here. Okay, so like I said before, we did a lot of refactoring, so take some time to understand what's going on. We basically created a routes folder. Inside the routes folder, we have an auth folder. Let's say, for example, I might have a user's route. So I'm going to create another folder, and I'll create an index.ts file for that, and I'll literally do the same thing. For example, I can create the router, and for every single possible route, let's say, for example, this is going to be /user / profile, right? Let's say you want to get the user profile. They would visit /API/user /profile, except we're not going to prefix this with /user over here. We're going to do that inside this main index.ts file. So I can import user routes from /user. And what I can do is I can call router.use and pass in user for the route, and I can pass in the user routes now. And that will literally register every single route that is registered in the user router. It'll prefix it with /user. So in order to visit this route, it would be /API, right? Because we have the main router that registers everything, and then inside the main index.ts file, we are prefixing everything with /API. So you'd visit it by accessing /API/user /profile. Okay, just wanted to make that very clear. So you can see that following this pattern, following this file structure, makes it a lot easier for you to manage your future possible routes, and it makes it easier to maintain your project. Okay, might seem very confusing at first, but once you get the hang of it, once you study it a little bit, it'll make a lot more sense. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And for example, if I were to go over here, and I'll just go ahead and just return a string. So if I wanted to access this route, we would just do /API/user profile, and you'll see that it should return, let's see, seems like, let me see, we have /user, or maybe I do actually need the request and response object. Maybe I can't do that. Whoops. I thought I could. Okay, there we go. So you can see now that when I visit /API/user /profile, it'll give me hello. All right, so just wanted to do that little quick express tutorial real quick. Anyways, so now what we're going to do is we're basically going to set up the other routes. So we have two more. So we do have a /API/auth/user, and this is responsible for giving the user data. Now, in the first tutorial, we actually had a variable for our access token, and we were able to actually use that to exchange it for the user, for the user object from Discord. Now, in your own platform application, you likely would not want to request the user directly, but instead you would want to, or actually let me rephrase it, you would not want to request the Discord user, the user from Discord's API. Instead, you would want to return your own user entity. So since we don't have a database yet, we're going to actually, we're going to put the logic, we're actually going to omit the logic for now, because this logic is going to be slightly different. But what I'll do is I'll create a file, or I create a function, and I'll call it is export async function get user, or get authenticated user controller, and it will literally have these same parameters for our other controllers. And for now, we'll just return a 200 status code because we're not going to implement it just yet. Okay, and then we can just import that up here. Okay, now for the revoke route is also going to be slightly different, because this is going to require us to have the token, and we don't have anything saved. And because we don't have any global variables defined in our application, we can't really just access the token wherever we want. Okay, and we're going to actually save it to the database. So first, let's actually just create another controller, and I'll call it, let's see, let's call it revoke access token controller. And it'll literally just be the same function. We'll return a 200 status code. And we will import that here and then pass this in. Okay, so if we were to visit these routes now, so if I were to go to /auth/user, it would give me an OK. If I go to /auth/revoke, it'll give me an OK as well. All right, so that's going to be it for restructuring our code. Glad we got that out of the way. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go ahead and implement saving the user to the database. I know it took quite some time, but I wanted to make sure I explained the whole file structure before we continued with the actual implementation. So here's what we're going to do. Let's just clean up the main index.ts file. So I'm going to delete this request and response. I'm going to delete the import URL and the import Axios. And you're also probably wondering what exactly is this import reflect metadata. So that's actually going to be required for type ORM. Now, if you already have the code already that I had, this is, remember, if you have the code from the first tutorial, you should already see the type ORM and the reflect metadata as well as MySQL 2. Now, a couple things that I need to mention before we proceed. So we are going to be using MySQL for the database. If you don't want to use MySQL, I would highly recommend you do, or at least use something like PostgreSQL. It's very easy to install either one of them, and type ORM is actually works for both of those databases. Okay. Another thing is you're gonna have to install a couple of dependencies in order to get type ORM to work. So I'll walk you through that. So we're going to go ahead and install MySQL 2. We're also going to install type ORM and reflect metadata. So reflect metadata is just something that you need to install in order to get type ORM to work. So you don't have to worry so much about that. Type ORM is the actual library. It's an ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapper, and it allows you to map your database records, your database tables to an actual object itself in the language that you're working with. So for example, instead of us having to write MySQL or any NoSQL query, like for example MongoDB or MySQL, the ORM actually provides a bunch of functions that you can use to insert, read, create, update, basically perform CRUD operations very easily without having to worry about writing a single line of a database statement. Okay, so that's really nice. And MySQL 2 is just the driver. Make sure you install MySQL 2 and just not MySQL itself. Okay, and this is the driver that's going to actually be used to connect to the database. So make sure you have that. So you're gonna go ahead and do yarn install these three dependencies, and once that's done, it should be fine. That's really all we need to install. And again, you can install this with npm as well. It works the same way. Okay, so now that you have those installed, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and actually establish a connection to the database. Okay, so let me actually go ahead and just remove, I'll remove these two as well. And I'll remove this for now because we don't really need that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to need to connect to the database. We're going to have to connect to MySQL. Okay, so make sure you have MySQL installed. We're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to go ahead and import the create connection function, and that's going to be imported from type ORM. I know there's a couple of functions that pop up, but make sure you import create connection from type ORM. And we're going to need to pass in the options for connections. Okay, so I'll walk you through what that's going to be, or what we have to pass in. So what we're going to do is for the type, we're going to pass in MySQL, and you'll see that type ORM supports many different types of database engines. Okay, so you can even use MongoDB as well. But like I said, we're going to be using MySQL. Okay. We're going to need to specify the username. So I think my username is test user. Your password, it should be test user 123. We're going to need the database name, so I'll just call this Discord OAuth2 DB. We're going to need to specify the host, so we'll do localhost because I'm on localhost. The port will be 3306. That's the default port. And finally, well, two more things. We are going to specify an array of entities, and I'll explain a little bit more of what entities are with type ORM. Okay, and we're going to also pass and synchronize and set that to true. You should also make sure that when you're ready to deploy your application, you want to make sure synchronize set to false. Synchronize is good for basically synchronizing your database with your entities as you make changes. So if you were to, let's say when you create an entity and it has a field called first name, that field basically gets mapped as a column in the database itself. And if you were to add additional fields to the entity, type ORM will detect that and it'll basically update the table and it will add those additional fields as columns. Okay, you don't want to do that in production, so make sure you have synchronized set to false when you're ready to deploy your app for production. Okay, so right now you're going to see that we actually have an issue, and it's saying that there's no database called Discord OAuth2 DB. We're going to have to create that. So I'm going to go ahead and log into my SQL database, but the connection worked, like we were able to log in, so that's good. So let me log into my database, and we're going to go ahead and create the database right now. So I'll simply just create the one that we need. So Discord OAuth2 DB. And there we go. And I can just simply close this out because I don't need it anymore. Okay, so if I save, you should see that it should connect and no error was thrown, so that's good. Okay, and I also will do one more thing. I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to actually wrap this inside a try catch. And if there's any error, we will simply log the error. Okay. Okay, yeah. So if there's any error thrown, it'll be caught. But since there's no error, that means it was able to connect to the database. Okay. So that's good. And we'll also write a console log. We can also say something like connected to the database. Okay, cool. So now that we've connected to the database, we can start creating entities. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a folder. I'll call it utils. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to rename this to type ORM. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder called entities. And inside that folder, we're going to create a user.ts file. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our first entity. And what exactly an entity is you can think of it like a schema, right? It's basically going to be a class, and that class is going to act as our schema. So, for example, export class user. And if we want to have, let's say, fields for our user, we can define them like so. So, for example, let's say the user has a first name. We'll type entity to be a string. So right now, this does nothing. We have to do a couple things. We have to annotate our class and each field. So that way, type ORM knows that this is an actual entity. Before we do that, make sure in the tsconfig.json file, make sure that experimental decorators as well as emit decorator metadata are set to true. In the first tutorial, these were actually commented out. But in the code itself, it should already be set to true already. So if it is, that's good. Okay, because we are going to be using something called decorators. Okay, so for example, for the export class user, on top of the export class user, we're going to use the entity decorator. And we're basically going to mark this class as an entity. So I'm going to give this a name, and I'm actually going to change the name of this user. Actually, I'll call it actually, we'll leave it alone. We'll just call it user. I don't have any other special name for it. Okay, so this will literally mark this user as an entity. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create create a couple of columns now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use the, well, first I'm going to delete that first name field because we're not going to need that, because that doesn't really fit the domain of the user, because for Discord users especially, we don't have the first name. So I'm going to use the column decorator, and after that, I'm going to go ahead and let's just get the user's member ID, or the, actually I'll call it user ID, or Discord ID, sorry. And that'll be a string. And now inside the decorator, inside the parentheses, you can actually pass in an object, and you can set the name that you would like the database column to be named. So for example, in the code base inside our TypeScript files, if we were to reference the Discord ID, we would just reference it exactly the way you see it. But in the database, it would actually be mapped to whatever you want to name it here. And for MySQL, I think it's better to use snake case. I think that's the actual the case convention for MySQL. So I'll leave it like this. And if we try to actually register this entity the way it is right now, it's actually going to throw an error. So let's see what happens, and I'll explain why. So you're going to see an error. It's going to say you should have a primary generated column, or a primary column. So it says entity user does not have a primary column. Primary column is required to have in all your entities. And so you can either use the Discord ID as a primary column, but I probably would recommend just having your own primary column that's generated. And you can think of that as the primary key. So for example, set this to be the number. So basically you can think of this as the auto-generated key that's going to be incremented every single time. Okay, so what we did was we created our first entity, and we called it user. And what we did here was we imported user. Okay, we imported from the type orm/entities folder, and we pass that into this entities array. Now what happens is if we actually log into our database again, so let me actually do that real quick. So let's log in, and let's use the Discord OAuth2 DB database, show tables. You can see we have our users table now. Let's select from that. Nothing is in there. Describe users, and you can see literally type orm does everything for us. We have two columns. Discord ID is a string. You can also, I think you can also do one more thing. You can specify the type as well. So for example, if you really want to specify it as a text or like something bigger, like a big int, you can do that. You don't have to necessarily use strings. I know Discord IDs, they're numeric values, but they're very large values. So you can either choose to store it as a string, but I also recommend just having the primary key as well. Because I think that'll be a lot better for indexing and stuff if you have a lot of relational data, especially. So you can see over here we have Discord ID, and then we also have the primary key over here. And if I were to add additional data, so let's say for example, I'm going to add the access token column as well as the refresh token column. Okay, and you're going to see that in the database now, if I were to describe it, you're going to see that it gets updated. And you're going to see that if we don't specify that name property inside the object for the column options, it'll just name the column the way that we have it as the field. But I can also change that whenever I want. So let's just pass that in. And then if I were to describe it again, it should update. There you go. And we can change the refresh token, and that should also update as well. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so that's going to be pretty much it for that. So let's just leave the connection to the database in the terminal. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to start saving the user's data to the database. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside the controller. And inside this auth Discord reader controller, let's actually modify what we have over here. So one thing that we should do, and this is actually something that is good practice, is you don't want to do too much in one function. And you always want to try to break up your function as much as you can. Basically because if one thing in the entire function fails, that's not necessarily good. So you want to try to separate concerns as much as possible. Right now, we have a couple things that is going on. Well, not really. We actually have one main thing, and that's really just making that post request to the OAuth2 / token route. And what that does is it literally just exchanges the code for an access token. So we're not doing too much, which is good, but we don't want to do that in the controller level. We want to actually create a service. We want to create a service layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a folder called services. And I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll call this auth. So all these services belong to auth. We'll go over here. And I'll call this index.ts. Okay? And we can go ahead and name our functions the way we want. So what I'll do is I'll simply just create a function that's going to wrap this Axios call. Okay? So for example, I'll create a function called exchange access code for token, or I'll call it credentials better, or expressing function, sorry. Okay, and the next question is, what should this function do? And the function is literally just going to make this Axios call. So we're not going to do any API calls in the controller. We're gonna pass that down to the service level. Okay. So we're going to import Axios over here, and all this function is going to do is we're just going to return Axios.post, and we're going to provide the URL. Okay, so let me actually do one more thing. I'm going to create a folder called utils, and I'll create a types.ts file. Because since we're using TypeScript, we might as well type annotate things that should be type annotated. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an enum. So export enum, and I'll call this API, or I'll call it Discord routes, or Discord API routes. And we'll call this OAuth2 token, just because I don't want to have hard-coded values. Okay. So I think that's one of the main routes that we'll have. I know we have a couple more, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so now I can go ahead and import Discord API routes. And instead of having a hard-coded value, I have an enum. Also, you can think of it like a constant, okay? If you're not using TypeScript, you can just create your own object with a property called OAuth2 token and set the value of that property to the actual URL. Okay, so we're going to need the form data next. So we'll go ahead and just take in a parameter called data. And we can also type annotate that as well. But it's going to be a little bit tricky because we also do need to have the URL search parameters. So I think what we'll do is we'll create that inside here. So what I'll do is we'll leave data alone for now. We'll pass that in here. And for the config, I'll actually import that from another file. So here's what we're going to do. Let's go back into types.ts. And let's create the type for the parameters for exchanging the access token. So I think what I'll do is I'll call this export type. Let's call this OAuth2 token exchange params. Not really the best name, but we'll call it this for now. So yeah, actually OAuth2 exchange request parameters. Okay, so we're going to basically type annotate whatever we need. So the client ID, the client secret, the grant type, we'll also provide the code as well, and then the redirect URI. Okay. And so why am I doing this is because I don't want to just use any as a type. I want to actually be very explicit with my types, so I can make sure that I'm passing the correct object into this, or the correct parameter types into this function, or the correct parameter object with the correct values. Okay, And then we'll also, I'm going to create a file called constants.ts. And the constants will just be raw values. So for example, we will need an Axios request config. So I'll just create a variable called Axios config. And I'll type annotate it to that so we can get IntelliSense. For the headers, we'll just simply do content type application x www form URL encoded. Okay, so instead of just having all these hard-coded values, we actually have them defined somewhere. So if we need to change those values, they will be updated everywhere that is referencing those variables, which is good. Okay, so we're going to import that right over here. So now we have a post request that calls the OAuth2 token route. It passes in any necessary data, and then it will also pass in the necessary Axios config. Okay, now we need to do one more thing. We also need to make sure we are creating, or we need to make sure that the data that is sent is URL encoded. So we're going to do that with the URL search params. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let's see. So I think the best thing to do is I'll probably just create a function called helpers.ts. And ideally, like I said, you could do this all in one file, but again, I would highly not recommend that, only because it just gets messy over time, and you want to, like I said, separate concerns. You want individual like files, classes, or functions to do what it's supposed to do instead of having to do too much. Okay, so we're going to create a function. It doesn't really need to be an async function because it's not going to do anything asynchronous. So we'll do, I guess I'll call this export const build access, or I'll call this build OAuth2 request payload. Okay, and this function is, all it's going to do is it's going to take in the data, which is going to be the type OAuth2 exchange request params. And it's literally just going to return this right over here. So new URL. Okay. We're going to pass in all of the data. So for example, let's see. I think we could just do data like this. And that should also be fine. We're going to return a stringified version of that because we can just pass it in like that. Okay, and so if we were to actually call build OAuth2 request payload, what exactly would it look like? Well, very simple. So we're going to go ahead over here, and we're going to basically do this const, let's call this payload equals build OAuth2 request payload, pass in data. And then we're going to pass in the payload instead, just like that. And like I said, you could technically do this inside this function, but like I said, you don't want your functions doing too much. And we can reuse this. If we want to. Okay. So essentially, what we're doing is we're basically just passing that in. Now we need to call this function now. Okay. We need to call this exchange access code for credentials. So instead of doing all this, we're going to do this. So let's go ahead and get all of this code out the way. And let's call exchange access code for credentials. Let's pass in the necessary data that we need. Okay. And it's going to take this object. Okay. It's going to get the actual stringified version. It's going to basically URL encode it, and then we're going to send that to the Discord API to get the credentials that we need. That's all it's doing. Okay, pretty cool. And I can go ahead and store the response if I want to, and we can console log it as well. So response data. Okay, so let's see what actually happens when we visit the URL. So let's go ahead and try this out. So you can see that we authenticated successfully, and if we look at the logs, you should see that we have the access token as well as the refresh token being logged down over here, which is good. Okay, so once we authenticate the user, what we want to do next is we want to save the user to the database. So now that we have authenticated the user, we got the access token and the refresh token, but we need to actually get the user's details. So the way that we're going to get that is, well, the same thing that we did in the first tutorial, where we invoked the slash API slash v8 slash users slash @me endpoint. We're going to call the endpoint and pass in the access token. Once we do that, we can get the user data and we can start saving the things that we need to save to the database. And like I said, we're not going to get the user data inside this exchange access code for credentials. We're going to create another function. Okay, so we'll create another function and we'll call this get Discord user details. And let's see, get user Discord details is essentially going to do what we did in this route handle over here. It's going to call this URL with a post request. It's going to pass in an authorization as the headers, and that's literally going to be it. So let me get the URL real quick, and we're going to store that in our enum. So we'll call this I guess I'll call this OAuth2 user. Yeah, I guess we could call it that for now. And we'll simply just do this. So we need the access token. Remember that that's very important. Without that, we cannot do anything. So what I'll do is, let's see, we'll take in an access token. So what I'll do in this function is we will simply just call the axios.getEndpoint, Discord API routes, OAuth2 user. And we're going to need headers, so I'll actually just store those headers over here. Well, actually, it's going to be a little bit tricky because we do need to pass in the access token, so instead, I'll actually just create another helper function. And I'll call this auth headers. We'll take in an access token. And it'll literally just return an object. So let me see. Well, let me do this. Axios request config. Let me type annotate it. And for the headers, we'll just simply do authorization and then bearer access token. Okay, so whenever I call this auth headers function, it will give me all of the headers, or it'll give me the headers that I need. If you'll let me call it. Yep, there we go. Perfect. All right, cool. And this should call the API for us. And it'll pass in the auth headers. And like I said, it's just an object that's being returned. But additionally, if I have additional headers that I need, I can always simply just add on top of this. But I'm not too sure if we should combine the auth headers with the content type. But if you have additional things that can be added dynamically, you can always just reuse this function. Like you can add additional options too. But for now, we'll leave it like this for now. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll simply go back to the controller level. I'll log response data. Actually, let me do one more thing. So let me actually authorize again. And let me go over here. And like I said, since we're using TypeScript, I want to type annotate as much as I can. Let me go ahead and type annotate the response. Because here's what I'm going to do. So let's do Discord OAuth2 response. Not sure if, actually, I'm going to do Discord OAuth2 credentials response. And I'm just going to literally type annotate this whole thing. And we're going to use that because the axios.get or axios.post, those functions, all are a generic type. And you can actually type annotate the response so you can get IntelliSense. So I'll show you how that works in just a second. So we're basically just going to type annotate everything the way that we see it is being logged. So right now, if I wanted to reference response.data.access token, I can, and that'll still work fine. It won't throw an error. But we don't have any IntelliSense, right? Now, I'm not sure if that's really important for some of you guys, but some people it's pretty important. So watch this. If I go into Axios.post, and if I actually just hover over, you'll see that there's this generic, the less than greater than symbols, which indicates that it's a generic type, and you can see that there's a generic type over here. So we can actually type annotate it to whatever we want, and we can get IntelliSense on the response. So right now, if I type annotate that, you'll see that if I hover over here, you'll see it's an Axios response of type Discord OAuth2 credentials response. And if I were to access data, I can access all of the properties, or all of the properties. You'll see that all the properties pop up in IntelliSense because I had type annotated inside here. So just wanted to mention that, like a neat trick. So I figured I'd mention that. But what I'm going to do is I'll simply just, let's see. I'll destructure the access token for now. We're going to call get Discord user details, pass in the access token. And let's see what is being returned. So I'm going to go ahead and just send that back to the user again, or send that back to the page as a response. And there you go. You can see that I have the ID, username, avatar, discriminator, and everything else. Okay, so let me go ahead and type annotate that as well. So now there might be additional things that might be returned. For example, right now you can see that there's no email, but if you have the email scope, it will return the email. So we should also account for that as well. But we can note that it's an optional, like it could be null or undefined. So this go to user response, and let's see, we have the ID, username, avatar can be string or null, discriminator is a string. I don't want to do like, so I don't want to use the question mark operator because that means that it would actually be undefined, but the avatar property seems like it'll always be there, but the email property is not always there. Okay. So I'll use a question mark. So it'll either be a string or it's going to be undefined, which means that it won't be defined in an object. So what else? Public flags. And you don't really have to type annotate everything. You can just honestly type annotate the things that you really care about. But yeah, for now we'll just do that. It's always good practice to type annotate as much as you can. I mean, that's kind of one of the nice things about TypeScript, because it gives you a lot of advantages whenever you are debugging your applications. Okay, so you can also check the Discord documentation to see what is returned. For example, in the documentation, it'll give you all the possible fields, and keep in mind that not every single field will be there. It'll tell you also what scope will give you what, so you can see that if the email scope is there, it'll give you verified as well as email. So we can also additionally add a verified, and I think that's a boolean, and that's going to be undefined for now, for us at least. Okay, well, actually verified's a boolean. Okay, and yeah, you can see that there's also other stuff too. I think we have everything already. For some reason, system does not pop up over here. I'm not sure why, but like I said, you can just use this. You can type it, annotate whatever you want, and yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And that's if you're using TypeScript. So I'm going to go ahead and take this, and I'm going to type annotate the response of the Axios.gets that calls the Discord API to give us the user. Okay. And now I can just simply type annotate literally whatever I want. So you can see that I have IntelliSense now. Okay, pretty straightforward. All right, so now what do we want to do next? What we want to do next is we want to go ahead and save the user to the database. Okay, but what exactly do we want to save? Now, like I said, that's up to what you need for your application. So for example, for our application, we really only care about the member ID. I don't really care about anything else. Like the username, I don't really care about because that's always going to change. The user can change their username as well as their discriminator if they have Discord Nitro, for example. Their avatar can always change, but you can always definitely save these if you really need it, right? But for now, we're just going to save the ID because the ID can never change. So we're going to save that. And that's a good way to be more persistent with your application. So if we go back to our type ORM entity, you can see that we only have three main things. We have the Discord ID, and we have the access and the refresh token. So we're going to save all three of those things. So I'm going to go ahead and just destructure the refresh token from the response that we got when we got the access and the refresh token. And for the user, I'm going to just destructure the ID. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to save the user to a database. So we're going to go inside the service file, our /auth/index.ts file, and we're going to go ahead and create a function called, let's just call this create user. Okay, and this is where we're going to actually interact with the database and save these to the database. So we're going to need the access token, the refresh token, and the Discord ID. Okay, so first what I'll do is I will create another type, and I'll call this create user params, and we'll call this let's see, the type is going to, we're going to need the Discord ID, the access token, then the refresh token. And what we're going to do next is inside the parameters for create user, we're going to type annotate that with the type that we just created. So when we call create user, we can ensure that all the correct object with the correct property and values type are being passed into this function. Okay, so we can go ahead and call create user now, and let's pass in all the necessary details. So for Discord ID, we'll do that. For access token, we'll do access token, refresh token, refresh, just like that. I know it's a little bit weird because we have a bunch of underscores and some of them we don't have underscores. Like I said, this is just the way that this access underscore token, that's just the way that Discord returns the data. But we'll just leave it like that for now. Okay. So I think that should be it. Okay. Now we just have to implement the actual save to database. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and use what's called a repository. And let me call this a new user. Okay, sorry about that. It gave me an error because I have user named up here, and I try to create another variable called user. Okay, so we're going to use something called a repository, and the repository basically allows us to access our database, as in doing things such as creating, reading, updating, and deleting stuff from the database. So it's also known as the repository pattern, and that's something that you can do in type ORM. If you don't want to use repositories in type ORM, there is also a connection manager, but we're going to use repositories. So what I'm going to do is let me actually see if I can actually get the repository up here. So we're going to import the get repository function. So that's going to be imported from type ORM. And we're going to import the user entity. And that user entity gets passed in as a parameter. I think there might be an error that's thrown. It might say something like cannot find default connection. And yeah, that makes sense because we have the user repository being imported up here. So I think it's actually trying to get the repository before the database has created a connection. And this is actually a downside because now we actually can't even import that up here, get the repository. If we wanted to reference the user repository, we'd have to actually do that inside the function itself. And you can understand why that might be problematic, because with every single function that you create, you would need to actually call get repository. So one thing that you could do, let's say if you don't want to create the repository every single time in the function, the reason why this is happening is because you can see up here, we have the routes being imported up here. So essentially it's importing everything before a connection has been established, and this actually gets called. So we can actually do a dynamic import. So essentially what the way that's going to work is we're going to do this. So we're first going to create the connection. Once the connection has been created, what we'll do is we can actually register the middleware. The way we're going to do that is we're actually going to remove this import routes, and we can actually just do a dynamic import. So const routes equals await import, and we can pass in the routes just like that. Okay. And right now it's going to give you a problem. It's going to say type of import is not assignable to application. That's because we're doing a dynamic import. So we can actually just reference the default, and that'll give you the actual router itself. Okay. You can also just do destructure default and call this routes, and that should fix that. So this should fix the issue with it creating the or with it trying to get the repository before the database connection has been established. So if we were to run this right now, whoops, not describe users, but if we were to start the app again, we shouldn't see the error anymore. There we go. So you can see that the database connection has been established. Once that's been established, we import the router from index.ts. Okay, we import it dynamically, and then we register the middleware. Okay, so that's one way that you can do that, so you can ensure that the repository is actually going to get the actual repository without it throwing an error like we saw just now. Okay, so what we're going to do is, now that we have a repository up here, we can actually reference the repository and do a bunch of things such as creating users, reading users, deleting them, etc. So we're going to have to create a user first. So this is actually a two-step process. So we're going to create the actual user by calling the create method on the repository. And you can see that inside the object, I can pass in all of the necessary fields. But since we already have params since we already have a type annotated the way that it should be, we can actually just pass in params like this. Okay, now this method does not actually save the user to the database. It just creates it. It just creates the entity instance. And what you need to do next is you need to actually save it to the database. So to do that, we just simply call user repository.save, and you pass in that new entity that was created from the create method. So you just pass in new user, and that will actually save the user to database. Okay, so if we go into the controller now, you'll see that this will return a new user. So let's see what happens. So let's go back and authenticate again. Okay, so if I go ahead and click authorize, you'll see that it now gives me, let's see, the user that was saved to the database. So it gives me the Discord ID, the access token, the refresh token, and etc., which is good. Okay, so you can see in the database now, if I were to select that from the database, you'll see that the record appears right there. You can see that we have the ID, the Discord ID, the access, and the refresh tokens. Now, another problem that we have right now is if I reauthorize again, you're going to see that's going to create another user with the same Discord ID, which you should not allow that to happen. So there's a couple of ways that you can fix this. So one, you can actually set the Discord ID. You can set the Discord ID column to be unique. So one thing that you could do is you can go into the user.ts file, and you can actually specify this to be unique. Okay. And what that'll do is you can see that it actually already throws an error already because there's duplicate entries. So if I were to do that, you'll see that there's duplicate entries. So let me just delete the user again. So the error should go away. So now if I actually try to authorize twice, so you can see that it creates a new user with the Discord ID. But if I try to authorize again, it's going to throw an error. It's going to say bad request. Okay, through an error, which is good because you don't want to have a user signing up twice with the same Discord ID. Now, doing this does work. Setting this to unique is good enough. Another thing I'd recommend is you should also do some checks yourself. You should also check the database, see if the database has the user, and if it does, return it. If it doesn't, create it. So we can do that by simply just fixing up this function. So what we can do is we can say const user db. That'll be the user from the database. So we can do user repository.find one. And we're going to find by the Discord ID. So I'm just going to do params.discord ID, just like that. And if the user, if the user has been found, so if user db, return user db. And if the user was not found, we'll create it. Okay, so this kind of adds like an extra, layer to our logic, but it just won't throw an error now. So even if the user tried to authenticate twice, even though we have that unique constraint, we have extra logic that doesn't actually cause an error to be thrown. So it'll just search for the user. If it's found, it'll return the user, and it'll just send it back as a response. So let's see what happens. So if I go back over here, if I click authorize, you'll see that it's going to give me the same user with the ID of 3. And it's going to keep giving me an ID of 3. Okay, so we have kind of like two checks where we have the default SQL unique constraint, and we also have our own check as well, which is good. So it doesn't throw an error, which is good. Okay, so I think that should be pretty much it for saving the user. Okay, so now if you really want to save the user's username, their tag, and etc., one thing that I would recommend is you can always do a update for every single authentication or authenticated request. So if you really need the username and the discriminator or the tag, so let's create another column. Let's just call this tag. Okay, and the tag we'll just leave it as tag because we don't really need anything else from that. If you really need the tag, you can definitely add that. And what I would recommend is every single time the user authenticates, you just have to perform an update on the tag and the avatar if the user has an avatar. For example, let's also add the avatar as well. And you know what? Let's just get the username and the discriminator as well. Okay, and we do need to modify a couple things. So for the create user params, we'll have the username, discriminator, and keep in mind that's the number. That's the number after the pound symbol on Discord. But it gets sent to us as a string, I think. And we're gonna get the tag as well. Oh, and the avatar. Avatar is a string value. So currently it's null because I don't have an avatar. Okay. So let's go ahead and pass in those necessary parameters. So what we can do is, let's see, I'll create a helper function. Build user. And this will just simply take in the Discord OAuth2 user response, and it'll just return everything the way we need it. So let's see, this will return a create user params type. So I'm basically going to create a helper function that will return everything as one object, so I don't have to have everything defined over here. So what we'll do is for Discord ID, that'll be user.id. For access token, that'll be user. Actually, we'll need another object as well. Credentials. So the type of the credentials will be a Discord OAuth2 credentials response. Okay, so credentials dot access token, credentials dot refresh token. And what else do we need? We'll need the username, the discriminator, user dot discriminator, avatar, user dot avatar. And I should also note that this avatar can also be nullable, so we will have to modify that in our entity. And we'll get the tag, user.tag. Okay, so right now it's, let's see what's going on over here. Let's see, did I not? Oh, wait, the tag is the username. Oh, so there is no tag property, I forgot. It's actually just discriminator and the, it's actually just the username discriminator. So I can actually, for tag, if I really want it, I could just do user.username and then user.discriminator. Whoops. Okay, so right now it's giving us this error is because avatar is nullable. So we should also note that. And inside the entity, we should also note that the avatar is nullable. Okay, and do that. Cool. Okay, so now we can just simply do, we can call this build user. Wait, why is it still giving us an error? Oh, wait, whoops. See, undefined is actually different than null. So the avatar is actually, the avatar property will actually always be there. It's just that it can be null or it can actually be the value itself. Okay, so it's saying use.avatar is not supported by MySQL database. I think it's because we had this union type, so we'll have to do that instead. Okay, so now we can just call build user and pass in, we can pass in the things that we need. So for example, credentials, or yeah, credentials, or actually let me do this, data credentials, and then data as user, and then we'll just simply pass in the user and the credentials. And for this part, we'll just do credentials access token. Okay, cool. So our code is looking a little bit cleaner. And now it's giving us another errors because property avatar, let's see, it's saying create user params not assignable to param of the part. It's complaining about the, yeah, it's complaining about our type. Let me fix that as well. So we actually cannot have, so it's saying string or null cannot be assigned to string or undefined. So let's fix that up real quick. I think, let's see. So we have avatar over here. We have avatar over here as well. So if I go into here, so this error is complaining about the avatar over here. But if I try to do this, it's complaining about that. So I think what I'll do is, and this is why TypeScript can sometimes be a little bit annoying, but it's okay. What I'll do is for the avatar, I think I'll just remove that. Yeah, I think I'll just remove that null value for now. And even if it tried to assign null into the database, we do have a nullable set to true. So it's not like there should be an issue, and we can prove that right now. So now that we have modified our code to save additional details, we need to make sure that it updates every single time. So when we click on create user, or when we call create user, we should do a couple things. One, if the user has been found, we should definitely update anything that needs to be updated. So for example, we want to update the username, the tag, etc., etc. So I'll create another function. I'll call this update user. And what we can do is we can simply, let me do this real quick. User repository update. I don't think there's a find and update. But there's also, I think there's also an upsert that you can use, which will insert it if the user was not found, or it'll update it. But we'll just create our own update user function. So the update user function will just take in the create user params, like right over here. And we're only going to call this function if the user has been found. So we are assuming that the user has been found. Okay. We'll also pass in the user instance as well. Okay. So what we'll do is and to update things in type arm is actually very simple. You can either use the repository, or you can just manually just assign values like this. So what we'll do instead is we'll just do return user repository.updates. And what we do here is we can pass in the conditions to search for the user. So for example, we can search for the user by Discord ID. Right over here. And then we want to provide the things that we want to update. So for example, we want to make sure we are updating the username, the ID, or not the ID, the username, the tag, etc., etc. Now, obviously, we could just destructure everything, but I don't think that would be good practice. I think it'd be better if we just only update things that we want to update. So for example, if I want to update the tag, let's do user, not user, but params.tag. If I want to update the avatar, it would be params.avatar. If I want to update the username, that would be params.username. And last but not least, the discriminator, params.discriminator. And whoops, forgot to do Discord ID. Okay, so like I said, you can just call update, or you can just do user.discriminator and just assign everything like this, and then you can just call user repository.save. There's many ways that you can do what you want to achieve, but this is one of them. Okay, so if the user was found, what we'll do is, I think actually the best thing that we should do is, because I don't think the update function returns a user, because if I actually look over here, it doesn't actually return a user. It'll actually return something else, which might not actually be what we want. So for example, if I do updated user equals awaits update user db params, and if I reference this, you're going to see that it's not even going to give me anything that I need, or updated user. It's not going to give me the actual user. So I think we should actually manually assign everything. So user.discriminator, params.discriminator. Let's see, user.tag equals params.tag, user.username equals params.username, and last but not least, we have the avatar. So user avatar equals params.avatar. And then we can just simply call user repository.save, pass in that user object. Okay, and this will actually return a user, so we can reference whatever we need. So that would actually be the way that we should do it. Okay, so if the user was found, we'll update the user. If the user was not found, we'll literally create the new user with all the necessary parameters. So watch what happens if I go back here, and if I reauthorize again, you're going to see that now I have all of the things that I had just added right now. So the user was found, and we update it. And if I were to change my username, it would do the same thing. If I were to upload an avatar, it would do the same thing. Okay, it's going to take the new data and update all the time. So that's pretty much it for updating the user. So I just want to show you how you can easily update users with type RM. There's two easy ways that we can do it. Okay, so if I were to call, or if I were to execute the select from users statement, or select all columns from users, you can see that we have all of our data. Okay, and keep in mind that like I said, we could have just simply destructured everything, but I really don't think that's a good idea, because even though the ID never changes, I don't think it's good practice to just, like provide a new parameter for Discord ID, even though it shouldn't change. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and end the video right here, because it seems like we actually did quite a lot now. We did a lot in the sense where we refactored our code and we were able to save these to the database and set up our database connection. So we were also able to get the main routes that we had. So for example, we have the /discord/redirect. We have the we don't have the /user route or the /revoke route yet. And the reason why we cannot implement those is because if we were to visit these routes right now, there's nothing that tells us who the user is that's visiting the route. There's no way that we can know. And the reason why is because we're not saving the user's data to a session. And the user also does not have any cookies that they're sending to our server. So there's no way that we can actually know who is making those requests. Okay, so in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to set up sessions. So it's going to be another lengthy video, but honestly, I feel like it's worth it because we do go in depth on a lot of things, and I want to make sure you guys understand everything. So I hope you guys can appreciate that. But in the next video, we are going to go in depth on how to set up sessions. We're going to basically use express sessions. We're going to save the session to the database. We're going to serialize and deserialize the session. And we're also going to do some validation too. So essentially, we're basically building our own, our own library, or not really a library, but our own authentication mechanism, and our own persistency with our application. Once we build out that feature, we can actually visit literally any route with the cookie from the client, and we'll know which user is sending the request. So I hope you guys like this video. If you guys like this video, please definitely leave a thumbs up. I really would appreciate that. And also subscribe. It really helps the channel. And I will also make sure that I commit the code to GitHub so that way you guys have the updated code. So when the next video is available, you'll have an updated reference. So like I said, the code will be in the description. And join my Discord server if you need any additional help or questions. The link is in the description as well. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. Once again, I thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Peace out.